Thank you.
Okay, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Supalak, and thank you for having me. I'm really pleased to be here, and I want to focus what I talk to you about in relation to climate change, really. And that won't surprise you because it's 36 days from today that we will convene in Glasgow in the UK for the COP26 conference. And I'm really delighted to see throughout your programme a focus on many of the really important themes for the UK government, including in our COP26 and our G7 presidencies. So let me turn to your question. So you asked what the region will look like after the pandemic. And the trends that I've seen in the region over the period of the pandemic aren't necessarily caused by COVID, but they certainly coincided with it, been accelerated by it, and perhaps even given us clearer choices and opportunities as a result of it. So I'm just going to show you two slides, if you can see these, which I'm putting up now. So the first, sorry, just one moment, there we go. So the first slide here I just want to show you is about the perception of the public on climate. And I think this is important because it connects for me with the idea of the public's perception of globalized risks, of which, of course, the pandemic and climate change are two. And I think what's really important to show here is the attitudes of the public in ASEAN are really quite serious in respect of climate change. They think it is a very serious risk. And if you look on the far left there, you can see quite clearly that 70% of the public in ASEAN think that it is an immediate threat to their well-being. And there's another slide in this same document, which the Yusuf Izias Foundation produced, which is an excellent report, and I commend it to you, which shows from the previous year that at the height of the pandemic in December 2020, ASEAN members of the public, 60% of them thought that the pandemic and climate were of equal priority. So that goes to show how seriously the public here saw it. And that mirrors, the UK situation where the government has tracked public attitudes towards climate change slowly growing in concern over the period of the pandemic. And in the middle there, you can see what the expectations are. So what's interesting, I think, is that most of the sort of impacts and risks around climate change in ASEAN are about the sort of resilient side, and that's issues like flooding, rising sea levels. But citizens in this region really want to see their government not only focusing on adapting to those risks, but also mitigating them, and that's about cutting emissions, doing more on public spending to secure a green recovery from the pandemic, tighter legislation, and even taxes on carbon. And on the far right, there is a really interesting illustration for me about the public perception of this as an opportunity, not as a risk or a drawback. So the top bar chart there shows that members of the public have a relatively low level of confidence that their governments are going to hit even their own targets on achieving renewables. But conversely, the bottom chart shows that they think there is a huge opportunity around it. So that will lead to more jobs and innovation and competitiveness. So there's a bit of a disparity there, I think. What I want to show you on the next slide is the second sort of big trend that I've seen over the period of the pandemic. And of course, this trend is one which has been accelerating for about 10 years, but it's increasingly visible and stark over the last 2 years. So that chart on the left shows you how much the cost of renewables has fallen over the last 10 years. So something between 26% for offshore wind and 82% for solar photovoltaic PV since 2010. The International Energy Agency said this year that solar is now the cheapest source of energy in history. And already solar is cheaper than the cheapest new power source for 2/3 of the population on the planet. So on the right there is how that compares with fossil fuels, and that presents a staggeringly clear economic case for me. So you can see there that the degree of competitiveness of fossil fuels relative to renewables. The International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, said that by 2030, it's likely that all existing coal, so coal that is already in place and firing, will be more expensive to operate than building completely new renewables. So you can imagine what a case that presents for building new coal now will be just stranded by that period. So these factors don't take into account the wider economics of constructing the energy transition. And what we've seen from organizations like the World Bank are that investing in renewables, energy efficiency, and technology that is a green, presents a green recovery, creates 4 times as many jobs as investing in the brown recovery, and it grows your economy between 2.5% and 5% faster than our current trajectory. So it's a very clear economic argument. And beyond the energy transition side, we've understood a lot more in the last 2 years about the impact of our actions in economic terms on nature, and the avoided costs of investing in climate resilient infrastructure and adapting to climate change. So that's really important in this region because the Mekong contains 3 of the top 10 climate risk affected countries in the world. And the World Bank recently assessed that for every $1 you invest in climate resilient infrastructure, you get about $4 back in economic benefits. So it's a very compelling argument. So let me end that presentation there, and then I'll turn my video back on so you can see me. So that brings me on, I think, to your second question, which is about what does this mean for my government? And it won't surprise you that we see this very much through the prism of COP26. So we delayed COP26 by a year because of COVID, and that was to make it as inclusive as possible, but also to make sure that when countries gathered in Glasgow, they did so not dealing with the immediate health response that was critical for the pandemic, but they were thinking about the recovery. And that means that as we gather now, we are thinking in those terms, and we're thinking about seizing that opportunity, which I set out on those slides that I showed you. We made a huge effort to make the conference inclusive. So we're paying for vaccines for all accredited delegates. We're exempting the leaders who are attending Glasgow from quarantine, even if they're in what we would call a red list country. We have 100+ world leaders confirmed, which is a really good turnout, even for a normal COP, but particularly in the height of the pandemic. So that just speaks to the fact that it is such a critical moment for taking climate action. And there was a recent report from the International Panel on Climate Change, the independent science body which advises the UN and governments around the world on this, and it made it very clear that this is a crucial decade to take action. If we don't do so now, we will have little chance of keeping temperature rises at a manageable level. So what we need to achieve COP is to try and drive down emissions by about 45% from where we are now to 2030, and that is to keep the temperatures below or about 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial averages. And the science says that once you get to even that level, you're starting to see increasingly high risks of catastrophic changes to the Earth's climate and stability. So we really need to keep it to that level. With current commitments where we are now, we're on track for about 2.1 to 2.4 degrees. So there's a lot of a way to go. But we have got 70% of the global GDP now on track for net zero, under commitments to net zero by about 2050. That includes under the UK's G7 presidency. In June, we got all the G7 members to commit to a 50% reduction on their emissions by 2030. So the really key next step for us is that countries in the developing world, particularly the biggest economies like China and India and the G20, really take that ambitious action. And what we've seen by independent reports is that if the G20 comes together when they convene as leaders at the end of October, and they submit really good, solid plans to get those emissions down by 2030, we can get down to about 1.7 degrees above pre-industrial averages. So they can really make a huge difference, and there's so much leadership that they can show on this agenda. So that is the first big priority, the first of the 4 priorities for our COP26 presidency, keeping that 1.5 degrees alive. In this region, there's been some great recent commitments by Laos, Indonesia, and Myanmar in making those net zero commitments. And Singapore has also said it will reach it as soon as is viable. In the wider neighborhood, Japan, Republic of Korea, and China have also made really good commitments to reach that point. And we're hoping for more to come before Glasgow. And this week in the UN General Assembly, we've seen some fantastic further developments with President Xi Jinping committing to ending finance of overseas coal. And that is a really big priority for us in COP26. For this region, that will kill off 17 gigawatts of coal plants that are in pre-pipeline. And that's a crucial step in bending the curve of emissions before the mid-century. So we want to see countries like Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, which were part of those pipelines, now come forward with commitments to stop building new coal, following the path of Malaysia, the Philippines, and Indonesia, who have made similar commitments. Second of our priorities is adaptation, and that's really important in this region, as I said earlier. But globally, the Global Climate Risk Index recently said that in the last 10 years, there had been about $3.5 trillion in losses from extreme weather. And if you consider that in this region, insurance penetration is sometimes as low as 1%, you can imagine the economic impact that has. So we are calling on countries to spend at least 50% of their climate finance, their budget to tackling climate change, on adaptation to climate change. Thirdly is finance. And I want to be clear here that the UK presidency is putting huge pressure on the developed world to live up to its commitment to fulfill the promise to fund from private and public sources $100 billion worth a year of climate finance to the developing world. And we've fallen short of that so far. We're about 20% short of where we said we would be by this point. So that's a really crucial issue of the feasibility of making the transition, of equity, and frankly of trust. We're very clear, that we need to live up to that. So we were delighted to see the US doubling of international climate finance this week in New York, and they will now spend about $11.5 billion a year on climate finance. And of course, when we do convene in Glasgow, one of the key parts of those negotiations, the UNFCCC negotiations, are to finalise a part of the Paris Agreement, which will ensure cross-border flows of finance to help the developed world support the developing world, and make cross-border trades of carbon and finance will be implemented. So something called Article 6 will be completed, we hope, in Glasgow. And finally, just a point about the fact that we see as our fourth priority this as a global effort. So collaboration is really vital for this. It's not just about governments, it's also about the non-state sector and particularly private sector doing their part. So we have been focusing a lot on something called the UNFCCC Races to Zero, which show how the private sector can do their part in committing to reaching net zero. So, for example, the new Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero now has secured $70 trillion worth of financial assets under management, which are on a clear, committed path to net zero. So a huge weight of private sector finance is moving in that direction as well. And there is a parallel race to resilience, which is building the resilience of 4 billion people globally by 2030. So let me conclude on the question again of what next after COVID. And I think what I would really just emphasize here is that we must build back better. So last December, at the height of the pandemic, we had 75 leaders globally showing great vision and foresight in making ambitious commitments, and the Global Climate Ambition Summit that the UK convened in London. It was a virtual conference. So it's fundamentally in the interest of all of us to build back better now as we have this opportunity post-COVID. There's cleaner air, healthier communities, sustainable economic growth, and it's not a binary economic choice either, as I've said. So the facts of that speak for themselves for the UK. So we have managed to double our GDP by we've managed to increase our GDP by 70% since 1990, at the same time as cutting our emissions by about 40%. So it's really crucial we don't make the wrong long-term choices now. Pulling the old familiar levers for growth as we emerge from COVID of brown growth and fossil fuel funded growth will lock in slower growth for a generation. And it's really clear the case for that. But more importantly, in a region which is really integral to global supply chains and value chains, and it will be increasingly in its economic future, is the growth in the low carbon goods and services, which are projected to reach $7.5 trillion a year by 2050. It's a 3,000% increase from 2015 levels. So we really look forward to the future of this region as the newest dialogue partner of ASEAN, and to welcoming it to COP26 in 5 weeks' time and supporting its green recovery post-COVID-19. Thank you very much for having me.